The dress Nellie wore that night was not hers. It had belonged to her mother, stored for years inside a cedar chest, wrapped in linen cloth to keep it from yellowing. It was cream-colored with modest embroidery along the cuffs and hem, stitched by hand with fingers that no longer existed. Nellie had spent the entire afternoon adjusting the length with needle and thread, her eyes blurring not from sadness, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. She should not have had hope. She knew that. But Dorian had promised, not with elaborate words or grand gestures, with a look, with a handshake that lasted 2 seconds longer than it should have, with a whisper in the hallway of the inn 3 weeks before. At the Alliance banquet, I will present you to my pack, as my chosen one. She was 24 years old. She was nobody's daughter. Literally. No registered pack, no recognized bloodline, no clan seal marked on her wrist the way others carried theirs. She worked as a waitress at the Grey Stone Hall, the only neutral establishment between the territories of the 3 great northern packs, the place where wolves from rival clans drank at the same table because the rules of the hall were older and more respected than any rivalry. It was precisely that neutrality that made the Grey Stone Hall the chosen location for the Alliance banquet, the event that gathered leaders, betas, and representatives from every pack in the region once a year. Nellie had worked that banquet for 3 consecutive years, carrying trays, refilling goblets, being invisible in the way that people of low status learn to be. This time, she had not come to serve. Dorian had promised. The hall looked different when she arrived. The torches along the rough stone walls burned higher than usual, casting golden shadows over the pack banners that hung from the ceiling almost down to the oak tables. There was the black banner with the silver wolf of Pack Vorn, the torn bordeaux of Pack Crest, and at the center, dominating the other 2 by size and position, a banner Nellie had never seen up close, a background dark as a starless sky, with a wolf of white eyes embroidered in silver and gold thread, the symbol of the Northern Crown. The Alpha King had sent representatives to the banquet in previous years. He had never come in person. Nellie stopped at the entrance of the hall and felt the smell of the room hit her like a wave. Resin burning in the torches, cured leather, red wine and spices. And beneath all of that, the sharp and heavy scent of high-status wolves gathered in a closed space, a mixture of territory, power, and barely contained tension. She recognized that smell. It was the smell of a night that could shift direction at any moment. But she was wearing her mother's dress, and Dorian had promised. She found him near the central fireplace, speaking with 2 men she recognized as betas from Pack Crest. Dorian was the son of Pack Vorn's leader, tall, broad-shouldered, brown hair tied at the nape of his neck. He was not the most powerful wolf in that room, but he was the wolf who had promised her something, and for a time that had seemed like enough. When he saw her, something crossed his face, too quickly for her to name it. Nellie. He approached, but without the smile she had been expecting. You came. You said I should. She kept her voice steady. She had rehearsed this entrance hundreds of times over the past few days. I know what I said. He lowered his voice, leaning slightly toward her. But things have changed. My father. There are conversations happening, agreements between clans. You understand. She did not understand. Or she understood perfectly well, and that was exactly what made his words so difficult to hear. Dorian. You have no pack, Nellie. He said it the way someone states a geographical fact, neutral and inevitable, like saying winter was cold. My father won't accept it. Not now, with the king present for the first time. Every possible alliance will be sealed tonight, and I need to. I need to remain available for whatever the pack requires of me. Available. The word landed on her like a cold stone. You made a promise. She did not raise her voice. On the contrary, it grew quieter, more contained, the way a person goes still when something inside them is deciding whether to break. Promises made in hallways don't bind packs. He had the decency to look away when he said it. Go home, Nellie. This is not your world. For a moment she stood completely still. The fire crackled in the hearth beside them. Somewhere deeper in the hall, a man laughed too loudly, and the sound bounced off the stone walls like something trapped. The smell of burning resin grew stronger, or perhaps that was just the way her senses sharpened when pain arrived quietly, without warning, wearing the face of something she had trusted. She did not cry. She would not cry here, not in front of him, not in front of the banners and the betas and the golden shadows of a night that was supposed to have been different. She pressed her lips together, lifted her chin exactly 1 degree, and turned toward the door. She had taken 4 steps when she heard it behind her. Dorian's voice, already moving on, already speaking to someone else, already forgetting the shape of the promise he had just discarded. And beneath that voice, another sound. A low murmur rolling through the hall like the moment before thunder, the particular silence that falls over a room when something significant has entered it. Nellie stopped. Not because she wanted to, because every wolf instinct she possessed, dormant and unregistered as they were, told her that whatever had just walked through the main doors of the gray stone hall was not something a person turned their back on. She turned slowly. 3 men stood at the entrance. The first was broad and loud, even in stillness, with a grin already forming at the corner of his mouth as his eyes swept the room with the casual arrogance of someone who had never once doubted his welcome. The second leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, silver rings on his fingers catching the torchlight, watching the room the way a person watches a game they already know how to win. The third stood slightly ahead of the other 2. He was the one the room had gone quiet for. He was taller than the doorframe seemed built to accommodate, draped in a mane of black fur across his shoulders, dark leather armor crossed with thick straps across his chest. His hair fell in long black braids, and his eyes, pale and sharp as winter light through ice, moved across the hall with the slow, unhurried attention of someone who missed nothing and feared no one. A thin scar crossed his left cheekbone. He did not smile. He did not need to. Nellie had worked the gray stone hall for 3 years. She had served wolves of every rank and temperament. She knew how power smelled. Territorial, dense, pressed into the air like heat from stone that has been warm for centuries. This man did not smell like power. He smelled like the source of it. His eyes moved across the hall, and for 1 impossible second landed on her. Not on the room. Not on the banners or the betas or the leaders rising from their seats with their chests puffed and their chins lifted. On her. On Nellie, standing in her mother's cream dress with her hands steady and her heart doing something it had never done before in 24 years of a quiet and invisible life. Then he looked away, and the room remembered how to breathe. Behind her, she heard Dorian's voice falter mid-sentence. Good, she thought, with a coldness that surprised her. Let him falter. She did not leave. Not yet. Something had shifted in the architecture of that night. Some weight had redistributed itself, and Nellie, who had spent her entire life learning to read rooms before rooms could read her, understood without being able to explain it that walking out that door right now would be the single greatest mistake she had ever made. She stayed. She pressed herself near the wall beside the corridor that led to the kitchens, the place she knew better than anyone in that hall, and she watched. The Alpha King, because it could be no one else, crossed the hall without hurry, and every person in his path made room without being asked. Nellie had a talent that no one had ever thought to call a talent. She noticed things. Not in the way that curious people notice things, looking for entertainment or gossip. She noticed in the way that someone notices when the air pressure changes before a storm, instinctively, physically, with the kind of attention that had kept her alive and employed in a neutral hall full of dangerous wolves for 3 years. She noticed which beta had been drinking since before the banquet started. She noticed which pack leader's jaw tightened when the king entered. She noticed that the man with the silver rings, the one who had leaned against the doorframe with that lazy grin, had not actually smiled with his eyes once since walking in. She also noticed that there were 4 guards at the entrance when the king arrived, and now there were 3. She filed that away quietly, the way she filed everything, and returned her attention to the hall. The banquet had settled into its formal rhythms. Long tables crowded with food that would go half-eaten, goblets refilled by the actual serving staff, which tonight did not include Nellie, conversations layered over conversations, the particular noise of powerful people performing ease they did not feel. The pack leaders had arranged themselves around the king's table with the careful choreography of men who understood that every seat choice was a statement. Dorian sat 3 tables away from where Nellie stood against the wall. Beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, was a young woman in a dark green dress with the silver wolf emblem of Pack Vorn embroidered at her collar. She was laughing at something Dorian had just said, her hand resting briefly on his forearm in the particular way of someone establishing a claim. Nellie recognized her. Sarah, the daughter of a minor Vorn elder. Pretty, documented, pack-sealed, everything that Nellie was not. She had been chosen instead. Nellie looked at the embroidery on her own cuffs, her mother's careful stitches, and said nothing to herself about it. There was nothing useful to say. The night had already declared itself, and standing here feeling sorry for the cream dress and the foolish hope it had carried would accomplish exactly nothing. What she needed was to leave with the same quiet dignity she had maintained in front of Dorian, walk back through the servants' corridor, collect the gray cloak she had left on the hook by the kitchen door, and disappear into the night the way she always disappeared, without fuss, without trace, without giving anyone the satisfaction of witnessing her come undone. She pushed off from the wall and moved toward the corridor. She had taken perhaps 6 steps when she passed behind the king's table. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the corridor entrance ahead of her, focusing on the specific stone tile that marked the threshold between the main hall and the passage that led to the kitchens and the side door and the cold night air outside that she needed more than she had ever needed anything. But she passed close enough to catch his scent. It stopped her breath. Not in the way that overwhelming things stop breath. Not with force or intrusion. It was more like walking into a room you had somehow always known existed, but had never found the door to. Cedar and iron, and something older than both. Something wild and deep and entirely without pretense. She kept walking. She did not look at him. But she heard very quietly the sound of a man setting down a goblet. She reached the corridor entrance and slipped through, letting the shadows of the narrower passage settle around her like familiar company. The noise of the hall became muffled, filtered through stone. She exhaled. The kitchen corridor was lit by 2 torches set wide apart, leaving a stretch of near darkness between them. Nellie moved through it with the ease of someone who had navigated this passage in every condition, crowded or empty, lit or dark, calm or tense. She reached the hook by the kitchen door. Her cloak was not there. She frowned and checked the adjacent hooks, then the low shelf beneath them. Nothing. Someone had moved it, or taken it by mistake, which happened occasionally during busy events when the serving staff used the same corridor. She pushed through the kitchen door to check inside. The kitchen was wrong. It took her exactly 2 seconds to understand why. The kitchen during a banquet of this size should have held 6 workers minimum. Fires burning, pots moving, the controlled chaos of food service in full operation. Instead, it held 2 people she did not recognize, standing very still near the far wall, and the fires were lower than they should have been. And the back door, the one that opened to the alley behind the hall, was slightly ajar in a way that let in a thin, cold draft that had no business being there. The 2 people she did not recognize looked at her. She looked back at them. One of them moved toward the door between the kitchen and the main corridor, the door she had just come through, and she heard the sound that her body understood before her mind did. The heavy iron bolt sliding home. He had locked the corridor door. She turned. The other man had moved to the kitchen's second entrance, the narrow one that connected to the storage cellar stairs, and she heard that bolt too, lower and older, grinding into its housing with the particular sound of iron that was rarely used. 2 doors, both locked, the back door still open. Nellie stood very still in the middle of the kitchen and understood the geometry of what was happening. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not kitchen staff following wrong orders. The positioning was deliberate. The timing was deliberate. The locked doors were deliberate. Someone had planned to have the main hall sealed off from escape, and the king was in the main hall. She did not know why she was certain of that connection. She only knew that she was, with the same bone-deep certainty that had told her to stay when every sensible thought had told her to leave. The missing guard at the entrance, the doors, the lowered fires, the open back entrance that someone was meant to come through, not escape. Entry. Her hands were steady. She had always been grateful for that, the particular stubbornness of her hands in moments when everything else inside her was moving fast. She turned back to the kitchen door that opened to the main hall and tried the bolt from her side. Locked from the other side, as she had expected. She pressed her palm flat against the wood and thought quickly. The serving hatch. Every hall kitchen had one. A narrow rectangular opening cut into the wall at shoulder height, used to pass dishes through to the servers in the corridor without opening the full door. The gray stone hall's hatch was old, and the latch was loose. She had known that for 2 years, had mentioned it to the hallkeeper twice, who had done nothing about it, because nothing in the hall ever changed until it had to. She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps, lifted the loose latch without sound, and pushed the hatch open just wide enough to lean through and see the corridor. The main hall door at the far end of the corridor was still open. She could see a slice of the banquet, the edge of the king's table, the back of a dark fur mantle, the pale flicker of torchlight on braided black hair. She leaned further. "Hey." Her voice came out low and controlled, aimed at the figure at the table like a stone thrown with precision. "Hey." He did not turn immediately. When he did, it was slowly, with the unhurried attention of someone who had learned long ago that urgency in others was not automatically his urgency. His pale eyes found her through the hatch opening without any visible surprise, as though women leaning through kitchen walls was something he encountered and catalogued without alarm. "Your beta locked the exits." She said it clearly, without preamble, without softening. "The kitchen doors are bolted from inside. There are 2 men in here I don't recognize. The back entrance is open and unguarded. A half-second of absolute stillness. Then those pale eyes sharpened in a way that changed the entire temperature of the corridor. How many?" His voice was low and even and carried no panic whatsoever, only the focused compression of a man shifting from one mode to another with practiced efficiency. "2 that I can see." She paused, listening to the draft from the back door, to the particular quality of silence behind it. More coming through the back. He held her gaze for 1 more second. Then he rose from his seat without haste, without drama, and without taking his eyes off her, said something in a low tone to the man with the silver ring seated beside him. The hall, from what she could see through the narrow hatch, had not yet noticed that anything had changed. But something had changed. She could feel it the way she felt pressure before storms. What happened next took less than 4 minutes. Nellie knew this because she counted, the way she always counted things that mattered, marking time in the kitchen while the world outside the hatch rearranged itself with the quiet precision of a man who had clearly survived more than 1 attempt on his life and had long since stopped being surprised by them. Theron did not shout. He did not draw a weapon in the middle of the banquet hall and send the room into chaos. He leaned toward the man with the silver rings, said something in a tone too low for the surrounding tables to catch, and then sat back and lifted his goblet as though resuming a private thought. But the man with the silver rings was already moving, and the broad one, the loud one who had entered with that ready grin, was no longer in his seat. Nellie watched through the hatch and noticed, with the particular attention she gave to things that moved wrong, that both men had separated in opposite directions without appearing to coordinate, flowing through the hall like water finding two different cracks in stone. 3 pack leaders at adjacent tables had not registered any change. Dorian was still talking to the girl in the green dress. None of them knew. She pulled back from the hatch and turned to face the kitchen. The 2 men she did not recognize had not moved dramatically, but their positioning had shifted in the small, deliberate way of people who had decided something. The one closer to the bolted corridor door had turned slightly, putting his back to the wall. The one near the cellar stairs had his arms loose at his sides, weight forward on his feet. They were not kitchen workers. They were not confused or out of place. They were waiting for a signal. Nellie looked at the back door, still ajar, the cold draft still threading through it. She heard it then. Not footsteps. Wolves of training did not make footstep sounds when they chose not to. Something more subtle. The particular quality of air displacement that a body makes when it moves through a narrow space. Someone was coming through that back entrance. More than one someone. She had perhaps 30 seconds. She looked around the kitchen with the fast, practical eyes of a woman who had worked in this room for 3 years and knew exactly where everything was. The heavy iron pot rack above the central preparation table. The long-handled fire iron leaning against the near hearth. The stack of empty serving trays against the left wall, broad and flat and solid enough to matter. She picked up the fire iron. It was heavier than it looked, which was exactly what she needed. The man near the corridor door saw her do it and recalculated something behind his eyes. "Put that down." His voice was low, almost reasonable. "This doesn't involve you. You locked me in the room." She kept her voice level, the iron steady at her side. "It involves me now." The back door swung fully open. 3 men came through it. They moved with the coordinated silence of wolves accustomed to working together in tight spaces, dressed in dark clothing without any pack markings, no banners, no seals, no identifying colors. Anonymous by design. 5 total now in the kitchen. And Nellie with a fire iron and the loose-latched hatch at her back. The man who had spoken to her looked at the fire iron and then at the hatch behind her and appeared to reach a decision about which problem she represented. He took a step toward her. The hatch opened from the other side. Not her. She had not touched it. Someone had found the loose latch from the corridor side and pushed it open in one smooth motion. And through the narrow rectangular opening came something that was not a body, but felt like one. An arm, specifically, a large forearm in dark leather reaching through to grip the interior bolt of the corridor door. The bolt slid back. The door opened. Theron walked in, alone, which struck Nellie as either extraordinarily confident or extraordinarily reckless, and as he stepped fully into the kitchen and his pale eyes moved across the room in one single sweep, she revised her assessment. Not reckless. There was nothing reckless in that face. There was the absolute cold clarity of someone who had already accounted for every variable in the room before entering it. His gaze landed on the fire iron in her hand. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. More like the internal registration of an unexpected detail. Then he looked at the 5 men, and the thing at the corner of his mouth disappeared entirely. "I'm going to give you one opportunity." His voice in the enclosed kitchen was different from how she had heard it through the hatch. Lower, without the stone walls of the corridor to diffuse it, it carried a resonance that she felt in her sternum. "Walk out the back door. Leave the territory before dawn. I will not come after you tonight." Silence. The man who had told Nellie to put the iron down looked at Theron, then at the 4 others, then made the kind of decision that men make when they have already been paid and cannot afford the consequence of failing the person who paid them. He moved first. What followed was brief and decisive and not elegant. Close-quarters confrontations between trained wolves rarely were. Nellie pressed her back against the wall beside the hatch and did not make the mistake of thinking herself uninvolved. When the nearest man pivoted toward her rather than toward Theron, either as a hostage calculation or simple opportunism. She brought the fire iron up in a short controlled arc and connected with his forearm with enough force to redirect his momentum entirely. He stumbled. She stepped sideways. Theron was already there. She did not watch the specifics of what he did. She was focused on staying out of the way of bodies in motion, which required its own concentration. But she was aware of him the way you are aware of a fire in a dark room, by the heat and the light, and the way everything else in the space orients itself around it. It was over before the kitchen's second torch had burned down a 1/4 inch. 4 of the 5 men were on the floor or against the wall in positions they had not chosen. The 5th, the one Nellie had struck, was sitting against the preparation table holding his forearm with an expression of aggrieved recalculation. Theron was not breathing hard. He looked at Nellie. She was still holding the fire iron. She became aware of this and lowered it, not because she felt she needed to, but because the moment seemed to call for a reduction in combat posture. "You stayed." He said it as an observation, not a question, not accusation, not surprise, just the neutral registration of a fact he found worth noting. "You locked the hatch on your way in." She said it back in the same tone. "You knew I was in there." "I knew someone was in there." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't know it was you." "You don't know who I am." "No." He didn't look away. "But I noticed you earlier, when you came in." She did not know what to do with that sentence, so she set it aside the way she set aside things that required more space to examine than she currently had. "You're Beta," she said, returning to the thing that mattered. "The one who locked the doors from this side. He's still in the hall." "I know who it is." "Are you certain?" "Yes." "Then you already knew before tonight that someone close to you was planning this." It was not a question. He heard that, and something in his expression shifted, not toward defensiveness, but toward a kind of assessment. The look of someone recalibrating what category to place a person in. The man with the silver rings appeared in the corridor doorway behind Theron. He looked at the kitchen, at the men on the floor, at Nellie with the fire iron, and at Theron standing in the middle of it all with his fur mantle and his unhurried expression. "Took you 30 seconds longer than I expected." Silver Rings said this with the air of someone keeping score. She hit one of them. Theron said it without inflection. It complicated the geometry. Silver Rings looked at Nellie with an expression that was genuinely amused for the first time since she had seen his face. "She what?" "He came at me." Nellie set the fire iron down against the hearth. "I was in the room. It seemed relevant." Silver Rings looked at Theron. Theron looked at Nellie. "What's your name?" Theron asked. "Nellie." "No pack name." "No pack." He held her gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he looked at the men on the floor and back at her, and something in his face settled into a quieter, more deliberate expression, like a door closing gently rather than being shut. "You warned me through a kitchen hatch," he said, "in the middle of a banquet where you had every reason to simply walk out." "I almost did walk out." She was honest about that. "The cloak. Someone moved my cloak." "And if they hadn't?" She considered that. "I still would have noticed the guard count at the entrance," she said finally. "I notice things." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I can see that." From the main hall, muffled through stone, came the sound of raised voices and the particular commotion of a gathering that had just discovered something was wrong. The broad man, Theron's companion, had apparently made his move on the Beta in the hall, and the banquet had ceased to be a banquet. Theron turned toward the corridor door without urgency. Then he paused. "Stay close," he said, not looking back at her. The hall is about to become complicated, and you're safer near me than anywhere else in this building right now." Nellie looked at the kitchen, at the bolted doors and the open back entrance, and the men who had been arranged to prevent anyone from warning a king. And then she looked at the corridor where Theron had already begun moving. She followed. The main hall had not yet become chaos, but it was standing at chaos's door with its hand raised to knock. Nellie felt it the moment she stepped out of the corridor and back into the torchlight. The particular pitch of the noise had changed, conversations fracturing mid-sentence, chairs scraping stone, the instinctive physical alertness of wolves who had sensed a shift in the room's weight, but had not yet identified the source. 3 pack leaders were on their feet. The servers had pressed themselves against the walls. Someone had knocked over a goblet, and the red wine was spreading slowly across the oak table, like something that had decided it had nowhere urgent to be. At the center of the hall, the broad man, whose name she would learn was Caston, had a hand closed around the collar of a wolf she did not recognize from the front, but who was being turned, firmly and without particular gentleness, to face the room. When he turned, she recognized him. Not personally, by position. She had seen him at the king's table, seated 2 places to Theron's left, directing the serving staff with the quiet authority of someone who managed logistics, a beta. The one responsible for the king's arrangements at the hall tonight. His name, she would learn later, was Farron. He was not struggling. That was the first thing she noticed. He stood in Caston's grip, with a stillness that was not submission, but calculation, his eyes moving across the room with the rapid assessment of someone counting options. Theron walked through the hall. The room parted for him. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, simply with the involuntary physics of people moving out of the path of something they recognized as immovable. He stopped 3 feet from Farron and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Farron met his eyes. "How long?" Theron's voice was completely even. There was no anger in it that Nellie could detect, which she found somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. Farron said nothing. The doors were bolted from the inside. Theron continued in that same level tone. 5 men through the back entrance. The timing required someone who knew my movements for this evening. He paused. "How long, Farron?" The hall was completely silent. Farron's jaw shifted. "Long enough," he said finally, "to know that you're making the wrong alliances, that the Northern Crown is being directed by interests that will cost this territory more than you understand." "That's a political argument." Theron looked at him steadily. "You could have made it." To you, something heated briefly in Farron's expression. "You don't change course, Theron. You decide and you hold. Everyone around you learns to accommodate or leave. Or betray." Theron said it without particular emphasis, as though completing a list. Farron looked away first. Caston looked at Theron, waiting. The man with silver rings, positioned near the left wall, was watching the pack leaders with the careful attention of someone monitoring multiple points of pressure simultaneously. "Take him outside," Theron said. "He'll be held until we return to the northern seat. The council will hear it properly." There was something in the way he said it that struck Nellie. Not execution, not summary punishment in front of the assembled packs, despite having every power and arguably every provocation to do exactly that. A council, proper process. She filed that away with everything else. Caston moved. Farron went without further resistance, which said something about him too, she thought. Whatever his reasons, he was not a man who made a scene once the scene had ended. The hall exhaled. The pack leaders, who had been standing in the particular rigid posture of men deciding whether this was their problem or not, began the careful process of sitting back down. Conversations resumed in lower registers. The wine was still spreading across the table. A server, braver than the others, stepped forward and began quietly managing it. Theron turned. His eyes found Nellie with the same directness they had found her through the kitchen hatch, without searching, without adjustment, as though he simply knew where she was. He crossed the hall toward her. She became aware, in a way she had not been while fires were burning in her sternum and the iron was in her hand, that she was still wearing her mother's cream dress with its careful embroidery, standing in the middle of the Alliance banquet with no pack seal and no invitation and no reasonable explanation for her presence that didn't begin with a promise a man had broken 2 hours ago. Theron stopped in front of her. Up close, without the corridor or the kitchen between them, he was very large and very still, and the scent of him, cedar and iron, and that older thing underneath, was present in a way that she could not entirely organize her thoughts around. "You're the waitress," he said, not as dismissal, as orientation, placing a piece into its position. "I was. Tonight I was a guest." She held his gaze. "That didn't work out entirely as planned." "The man who brought you." His eyes moved briefly to the far table, where Dorian had been sitting, and where Dorian was now very carefully not looking in their direction. "He made you a promise he didn't keep." It was not a question. He had seen it, or he had understood it from context, or he simply read rooms the way she did, and the room had told him. "It doesn't matter now," she said. "It matters." He said it simply. A man who breaks promises in public, in a room full of witnesses, because it becomes socially convenient, is telling everyone in that room exactly what he is. She looked at him. "Most people in this room didn't notice," she said. "I noticed." He held her gaze. "I noticed when you walked in. I noticed when you walked toward the door. I noticed when you didn't make a scene despite having every reason to. Making scenes doesn't serve anyone." "No." Something in his expression shifted, quieter and more considered. "It doesn't." From the far side of the hall, the man with the silver rings appeared at Theron's shoulder with the smooth efficiency of someone who had perfected the art of arriving exactly when needed. "The pack leaders want a word." He glanced at Nellie with that genuinely amused expression she had seen in the kitchen. All of them, simultaneously, which is going to be as pleasant as it sounds. In a moment. Theron did not look away from Nellie. Silver Rings raised an eyebrow and said nothing, which she suspected was unusual for him. "I don't know your full name," Theron said to her. "Only Nellie. No pack name." "There's no pack to name." "Where are you from?" Not idle conversation. The question had weight. "My mother was from the Hill Territories." She paused. "The western ones, beyond the Ashford Pass." Something changed in his face. Small, controlled, but there. "What was her name?" The question surprised her. "Marin." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have you worked here?" 3 years. "And before that?" "I moved around." She watched him carefully. "Why does it matter where I'm from?" "Because you're sent," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it. "Doesn't match what you've described yourself as. No pack, no bloodline, no status." He paused. "But your scent is one of the oldest I've encountered in 20 years of leading the Northern Territory." She stared at him. "That's not possible." Her voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. "I don't make errors about scent." He said it without arrogance, as simple fact. "It's the one thing in this work that cannot be fabricated or performed." The torchlight moved across the stone walls. Somewhere in the hall behind them, the pack leaders were waiting, and the servers were quietly restoring order, and the night was attempting to resume its formal shape around the rupture that had torn through it. Nellie thought about her mother's cedar chest, about the dress she was wearing, about the hill territories beyond the Ashford Pass that her mother had left without explanation when Nellie was 4 years old, and had never spoken of again. "My mother never told me anything about where she came from," she said. "No." Theron looked at her steadily. I don't imagine she did. You knew her. I knew of her. A pause. Her name was known in the northern seat. Her disappearance was noted. The floor felt slightly different under her feet. Not unstable, just reconfigured. The way the ground feels after you've learned that the map you've been using was drawn for a different landscape. Theron. Caston's voice came from across the hall, carrying the particular tone of a man exercising patience at its outer boundary. The leaders are going to start talking to each other without us, which historically goes poorly. Theron held Nellie's gaze for one more moment. I have to address the hall. He said it directly, not as an excuse. Will you wait? She considered the question with the full weight it deserved. A man asking her to wait in a room full of people who had just watched her go from invisible to standing in conversation with the Alpha King, in her mother's dress, with no pack name and apparently a scent that meant something she did not yet understand. She thought about walking out of this hall into the cold night, back to her small room above the gray stone kitchen, back to the quiet, invisible life that had been sufficient until tonight. She thought about her mother's cedar chest and the things inside it her mother had never explained. I'll wait, she said. Theron nodded once. Then he turned and walked toward the waiting pack leaders with the unhurried authority of a man returning to work he had briefly set down, and the room organized itself around him again. Beside Nellie, as though appearing from the architecture itself, the man with the silver rings materialized with his arms crossed and his head tilted slightly. For what it's worth, he said, his voice low and conversational, I've worked alongside that man for 11 years. He glanced toward Theron. I have never once seen him ask anyone to wait. Nellie looked at him. What's your name? She asked. Soren. He extended a hand with those silver rings catching the torchlight. Officially, first advisor to the crown. Unofficially, the person who tells him when he's being an idiot, which is less often than you'd think, and more often than he'd admit. She shook his hand. Across the hall, she saw Dorian watching her from his table, Sarah's hand still on his forearm, his expression carrying the particular quality of a man watching something he had discarded be recognized as valuable by someone who understood value better than he did. She did not feel satisfaction exactly. It was quieter than that. More like resolution. The pack leaders took 40 minutes. Nellie knew this because she counted as she always counted, standing near the stone pillar at the edge of the hall, while Theron addressed the assembled clans with the same unhurried authority he brought to everything else. She watched him work the room without performing for it, answering questions directly, redirecting accusations with precision, never raising his voice once in 40 minutes of men who frequently raised theirs. Soren stood beside her for part of it, offering quiet commentary that she had not asked for and found she did not mind. The one on the left with the red beard is going to demand compensation for the disruption to the banquet, Soren murmured. He does it every year for smaller reasons. Does he get it? Never. But he considers the asking a form of dignity. And the one beside him? Genuinely concerned. His territory borders the northern pass. If someone is moving against the crown, he needs to know his eastern flank is secure. She looked at Soren. You brief people like this often? Only people worth briefing. He said it without flattery, as plain assessment. Caston appeared on her other side at some point, eating something he had retrieved from the banquet table with the unbothered appetite of a man for whom near combat was not an obstacle to dinner. He was large and loud even in silence, taking up more space than his physical dimensions strictly required, and he looked at Nellie with open curiosity. You hit Bran with a fire iron, he said. Was that his name? It is. He's going to be unhappy about it for a while. He came at me first. Oh, I know. Caston grinned, and it was the first fully genuine expression she had seen on anyone in that hall all evening. I'm not criticizing. I'm impressed. Bran is twice your size. The iron was heavier than he expected. Most things worth using are. He considered her for a moment with the frank evaluating look of someone who did not bother with social performance. You're not frightened. I was frightened in the kitchen. You didn't act frightened. Acting frightened in the kitchen would have been extremely counterproductive. Kasten looked at Soren over her head. Something passed between them that she did not have the context to fully read, but which felt like a form of confirmation. When the 40 minutes ended, and the pack leaders had been satisfied to the degree that pack leaders ever permitted themselves to be satisfied, Theron stepped away from the center of the hall and walked back to where she stood. The hall was quieter now. The formal structure of the banquet dissolved. Smaller conversations were forming in its place. Several people watched Theron cross toward her. She noticed Dorian among them, still at his table, Sarah no longer beside him. Theron stopped in front of her. Thank you for waiting. You asked me to. People don't always do what they're asked. I know. She looked at him steadily. I had reasons of my own. He held her gaze. The Western Hill Territories, he said, picking up the thread they had left. The bloodline from that region, the old one, goes back further than any currently registered pack in the Northern Territory. It predates the current alliance structure by generations. You said my mother's disappearance was noted. She left the northern seat when you were very young. No explanation was recorded. She took nothing except... He paused briefly. A cedar chest. Nellie went very still. How do you know about the chest? Because it belonged to the Northern Seat's archives before she left with it. His voice was careful, not accusatory, simply precise. It contained documents, bloodline records, the kind that would have established your lineage formally and irrevocably. She never opened it. Nellie's voice was quieter than she intended. She kept it locked. I only opened it after she died, and there was nothing inside except the dress. Theron looked at the cream dress, the careful embroidery at the cuffs, and something in his expression shifted into something older and less guarded than anything she had seen on his face all evening. The embroidery, he said. The pattern at the cuffs. She made it herself. It's not decorative. He reached out and, with a restraint that was almost formal, indicated the embroidery without touching it. It's a lineage marker, an old one, the kind that was stitched into garments before written records became standard because written records could be destroyed. She looked down at her mother's careful stitches. The needle and thread work she had run her fingers over 1,000 times. The pattern she had always thought was simply her mother's preference for symmetry, geometric and precise. Small, repeated shapes that she had never thought to read as language, because no one had told her it was language. She knew, Nellie said. It was not a question. She knew. Theron's voice was even. She hid you. Deliberately, carefully, completely. Whatever her reasons, she believed you were safer unknown than known. Nellie thought about her mother. About a woman who had kept her past locked in a cedar chest, and her history folded into embroidery, and her reasons for all of it pressed so far below the surface that not even dying had brought them up. She had spent 24 years being nobody's daughter. It had been a choice someone made for her before she was old enough to make choices. She breathed through the weight of that. What does it mean? She kept her voice level. Practically, for now. It means you have a claim to pack standing that supersedes every alliance being discussed in this room tonight. He said it plainly. The Western Hill bloodline never formally dissolved. It was abandoned, but abandonment and dissolution are different things in pack law. The lineage is intact as long as the last carrier is living. I'm the last carrier. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Dorian told me tonight that I had no world here. She said it without bitterness, simply as a thing she was looking at clearly for the first time. That I had no pack, no status, no place at any table in this hall. Dorian, Theron said, with a measured calm that somehow carried more weight than contempt would have, did not know what he was looking at. Across the hall, as though he had heard his name, Dorian looked over. His eyes moved from Nellie to Theron to the space between them, and whatever he saw in that space produced an expression that she recognized. Not quite regret. Something more uncomfortable than regret. The specific look of a person understanding, too late and too completely, the precise dimensions of what they had let go. She did not hold his gaze. There was nothing in it that she needed. She turned back to Theron. "What are you proposing?" she asked directly. "That you come to the northern seat." He said it with the same directness she had used. Not as a guest, not under obligation. As someone whose lineage entitles her to standing, to proper documentation, to the full record of where she comes from and what it means. He paused. "And after that, whatever you decide about your life is yours to decide. I don't deal in obligations I haven't earned." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the small room above the gray stone kitchen. About 3 years of carrying trays and refilling goblets and being invisible. About the hook by the kitchen door where her cloak had been, and how the absence of it had kept her in a room long enough to see something that mattered. About her mother's hands, and the embroidery that was not embroidery, and the chest that was not empty after all. "When do you leave?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning." She nodded once. In the end, the night resolved itself with the particular quiet of things that have found their correct arrangement. The pack leaders departed in their separate directions, alliances either strengthened or suspended pending further discussion. Farron was escorted to secured quarters under Caston's watch. The Greystone Hall's staff returned to their work with the industrious relief of people grateful for normalcy. Soren found a corner of the banquet table that still held decent wine and poured 2 goblets without being asked, handing one to Nellie with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had decided she belonged in the conversation. Caston told the story of the kitchen to 3 different people before the evening ended, each retelling featuring a slightly more dramatic arc for the fire iron, and Nellie did not correct him because the versions were genuinely improving. And Theron sat at the remains of the king's table with maps of the northern pass spread before him, working through the security implications of the evening with the focused attention of a man who did not leave problems for morning. And every so often his pale eyes moved to where Nellie stood talking with Soren, quietly and without announcement, the way a person checks that something valuable is still where they left it. She noticed every time. She said nothing about it, but she noticed. In the months that followed, the northern seat received her with the formal weight of something long overdue. The documents in the cedar chest, those her mother had removed, and those that had remained in the archives waiting, were reconciled and recorded. The Western Hill bloodline was restored to the official register. Nellie signed her name beneath the lineage marker, with the particular stillness of someone settling a question that had been open for 24 years. She was not the same woman who had worn the cream dress to a banquet, where a man had told her she had no world. She was the woman who had warned a king through a kitchen hatch, held a fire iron without shaking, and understood that the map she had been using was simply wrong, not because the territory did not exist, but because no one had handed her the correct one. Dorian returned to Packvorn's territory, and was not heard from in the northern seat again. The girl in the green dress married someone from the crest line. These things happened at their own pace and were not the point of anything. Farron stood before the Northern Council and gave a full account, which was more than most expected. The council deliberated for 2 weeks and reached a judgment that was firm and considered and did not require the kind of finality that could not be undone. He was removed from his position, stripped of his beta rank, and sent to the outer territories under monitored settlement. He left without drama. The northern seat moved forward. Caston remained exactly as he was, which was loud and large and genuinely good-natured beneath every layer of it, and became the person Nellie talked to when she needed someone who would answer a direct question with a direct answer and follow it immediately with an unsolicited opinion. Soren remained exactly as he was, which was sharp and watchful and generous with information he judged you capable of using, and became the person Nellie talked to when she needed to understand the architecture of a situation before stepping into it. And Theron. Theron chose her the way he did everything, without performance, without urgency, with the settled certainty of a man who had looked at something clearly and made a decision he intended to keep. He did not make promises in hallways. He made them in front of the Northern Council, in front of Kasten and Soren, and the assembled pack representatives, in the full formal weight of the world he led, on a morning when the light came through the stone windows of the northern seat in long pale bars, and the smell of cedar wood and iron was everywhere, and Nellie stood in a dress that was her own, stitched with a lineage marker she now knew how to read, and said yes with the quiet conviction of someone who had stopped being invisible, not because the world had finally seen her, but because she had finally stopped standing in the dark. The cedar chests sat in their chambers at the northern seat, open now, empty of secrets. Sometimes she set her hand on the lid of it and thought about her mother, about the choices made in fear, and the love folded into embroidery, and the long winding road from a locked chest to an open room. She was home. Not because someone had given it to her. Because she had walked through a kitchen, picked up an iron, and refused to leave. That was enough. That was everything. That was where the story ended.